The boy was only 19, alone on his father's ranch when he found her, an Indian girl, bleeding and half frozen in the snow. She could barely whisper a word, her skin pale beneath the moonlight. He knew helping her meant breaking every rule his father ever taught him. But something in her eyes, fear, and a strange kind of peace, made him stay. He wrapped her in his only blanket, held her hand through the night, and prayed she'd live till sunrise. But when dawn came, it wasn't light that woke him, it was thunder, hoofbeats, war cries. He stepped outside, heart pounding, and froze. 700 Apache warriors surrounded his barn, and all of them were looking straight at him. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The boy's breath came in clouds of white against the pale morning air as he stepped out from the barn, rifle shaking in his hands, his heart hammering so hard it drowned the sound of the wind. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, but the world still glowed silver and cold, the rising sun spilling light across a sea of horses and painted faces. The Apache had come in silence, their war paint dark against the snow, feathers stiff with frost, eyes glinting like flint. He counted at least 200 before he stopped trying enough to bury him 10 times over. Behind him, inside the barn, he could still hear her breathing, ragged, shallow, each inhale sounding more like a prayer than a promise. He didn't know her name, didn't know what had happened to her, only that she was dying and he couldn't bring himself to let her die alone. The tall warrior at the front dismounted, his moccasins sinking into the snow with the sound of soft, deliberate steps. He was older than the boy expected, his face carved by sun and grief, his eyes 2 black fires that didn't blink. The others watched in perfect stillness as he walked forward, the air between them heavy with the weight of 1,000 unseen ghosts. The boy swallowed hard, forcing the rifle higher though his hands shook so bad the barrel rattled. "I ain't looking for trouble," he said, his voice breaking on the wind. "She needed help, that's all." The warrior stopped a few paces away, his gaze falling to the barn, then back to the boy. He spoke in a low voice the boy didn't understand, his words deep and rough, like stones rolling through a riverbed. Another man, younger, stepped forward and translated with halting English. "You have her," he said. "The girl?" The boy hesitated, fear clawing at his throat. "She's hurt," he said quietly. "Shot. I found her near the creek last night." Murmurs rippled through the warriors, their eyes narrowing. The older man's expression didn't change, but something in his face flickered a shadow of pain, or anger, or both. He spoke again, and the translator's voice trembled this time. "She is his daughter." The words hit like a bullet. The boy's knees went weak. He turned toward the barn instinctively, his mind racing. His daughter? God, what had he done? But before he could move, the older warrior's voice rose again, sharp and guttural, and every Apache within earshot seemed to draw breath as one. The translator's face went pale. "He says, if she dies, you die too." The boy's throat went dry. "I didn't hurt her," he whispered, but the words sounded small against the wind, swallowed by the breath of the crowd. The warrior stepped closer, his eyes burning through the boy like fire through paper. For a moment, neither moved. Then the old man's hand shot out, gripping the rifle barrel and shoving it downward into the snow. The boy didn't resist. He couldn't. "Let me help her," he said, desperate now. "If I wanted her dead, I'd have left her there." The warrior stared at him for a long moment, then gave a single, curt nod before shoving him aside and striding toward the barn. The others parted for him like shadows peeling back from the light. The boy watched, heart pounding, as the man disappeared inside, the sound of his daughter's weak breathing the only thing breaking the silence. Then came a single, shattering cry from within, not of anger, but of heartbreak so raw it made the boy's chest ache. When the warrior emerged again, his face was wet with tears that froze before they could fall, and for the first time, the boy saw something worse than fury in his eyes, mercy balanced on the edge of vengeance. The air thickened like smoke as the chief's voice split the silence, rising from the cold earth like a storm. He shouted in his own tongue, the sound rolling over the crowd like thunder, his fury painting every word with a grief too deep for translation. The warriors surrounding the barn echoed his cries, their voices a chorus of rage, their hands gripping rifles and bows, the glint of steel catching the pale light. The boy's stomach turned to ice as he caught fragments of their words. Stolen. Taken. Vengeance. And when the chief's gaze locked on him again, he felt his soul shrink beneath it. Then came the English, rough and broken, but sharp enough to cut. You took her, the chief roared, his voice cracking, his hand pointing at the boy like a spear. The accusation hit harder than any blow. No, the boy shouted, his voice trembling, boots sliding back in the snow. I didn't. I found her. She was bleeding out. She needed help. His words spilled out too fast, tumbling over each other, desperate to reach someone who might understand. But the warriors weren't listening. To them, his stammering sounded like guilt, his fear like confession. A young Apache rode forward, his face twisted with rage, a tomahawk gleaming in his fist. Lies, he spat. White men always lie. Another echoed him, and then another, until the air itself seemed to pulse with fury, with the promise of blood. The boy could taste iron on his tongue, could feel his heart slam against his ribs. Please, he said, lowering his rifle, his breath coming fast. If I wanted to harm her, why would I have brought her here? Look inside, see for yourself. I kept her alive. But his voice was swallowed by the growing roar, 100 men shouting in a language he couldn't follow, every syllable another nail sealing his fate. The chief raised his hand, and instantly, silence fell so sudden it made his ears ring. The boy dared a breath. The old man's eyes glistened like obsidian, hard, unbroken. You lie, he said again, quieter now, but with a venom that made the snow feel warmer by comparison. You took her. You hurt her. His voice trembled, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of believing his own words. All men like you hurt her. The boy's throat closed. He wanted to scream that he wasn't his father, that he'd never raised a hand to anyone who couldn't fight back. He wanted to say that he didn't even know the world his father had built with cruelty and greed. But the chief wasn't seeing him, he was seeing history, generations of betrayal wrapped in one trembling boy's skin. Please, the boy whispered, taking a step forward. She's alive. She's breathing. Let me show you. A dozen bows rose at once, strings tightening, the sound sharp and final as death itself. He froze, his hands instinctively rising in surrender, the rifle slipping from his grip and sinking into the snow. No harm, he said again, voice cracking. I swear it. Behind the chief, an older warrior dismounted and knelt near the barn door, pulling back the hide flap just enough to peer inside. The boy's heart stopped as seconds stretched into lifetimes. Then the man called out in Apache, his tone softer, uncertain. The chief's head turned sharply, his nostrils flaring. The warrior said something the boy couldn't catch, but it made the old man hesitate just for a breath, just long enough for doubt to flicker behind the fire in his eyes. The chief looked back at the boy, his stare cutting deep, as if searching for something: truth, guilt, or maybe just a reason not to kill him where he stood. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low, heavy. If she dies, he said, you die. Then he motioned sharply, and the warriors lowered their bows. The boy stood alone in the clearing, trembling as the sound of horses shifting filled the air, knowing that for now he'd been spared, not forgiven, not believed, but given the cruel mercy of time, and the terrible burden of proving his innocence before the sun set on both their lives. The sound came like a crack in the frozen air, a single, high-pitched cry that cut through the ranks of men and through the boy's chest like a blade. The crowd parted before her without a word, every warrior lowering their gaze as a woman rode through the line, her horse stepping carefully over the trampled snow. She was older than the rest, her back straight, her black hair streaked with gray, and her eyes carried a weight that made even the fiercest warriors bow their heads. She wore a deerskin cloak stitched with beads that shimmered faintly in the pale light, and in her silence was authority greater than the chief's fury. The boy watched her dismount, her movements steady but trembling beneath the surface, as though she'd been holding her breath for 100 miles and had only now begun to let it go. She said something soft to the chief in Apache, too low for him to catch, but her tone made his face falter, pride giving way to dread. She turned toward the barn, walking with slow, deliberate steps through the snow, each one leaving dark impressions that filled with red water as the frost melted under her warmth. The boy opened his mouth to speak, to warn her that the girl was barely clinging to life, But the chief lifted a hand, silencing him. "No words," he said harshly. "You will stay." So he did, frozen in place, every breath burning in his chest as the woman reached the barn door and disappeared inside. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the wind seemed to stop, the horse's breath steaming softly as if nature itself held its breath. The boy's mind raced. He hadn't meant for this, hadn't meant for any of it. He had only seen her collapse by the stream, her blood staining the snow, and something in him, something good his father hadn't managed to kill, made him act without thinking. He'd prayed for her life with a name he didn't even know. Now, that prayer was being answered in the cruelest way possible. Then, from inside the barn, the sound came, a sound that would haunt him forever. It began as a whisper, a choked breath, and then it tore through the world like a scream pulled from the very marrow of grief. It was the cry of a mother who had found her child dying, the kind of sound that made men lower their eyes and wish they'd never been born. The boy's knees weakened. Around him, the warriors looked away, their faces pale, their weapons forgotten for the moment. Even the chief flinched, his jaw tightening as the cry grew and then broke, shattering into sobs that trembled with both love and rage. The boy could see the shadow of her form through the slats of the barn wall, see her falling to her knees beside the cot where he'd laid the girl, her shoulders shaking as she gathered her child's limp body in her arms. He heard her speaking to her in their language, words he couldn't understand but somehow knew by their tone, the words a mother speaks when she's trying to call back a life that's already half gone. The chief took a slow step toward the barn, then stopped, as if the weight of his wife's grief pinned him in place. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "Tala," he murmured. The girl's name finally spoken, carried on the wind like a prayer or a curse. "Our daughter." The boy's chest tightened until he couldn't breathe. Tala. The name meant wolf. In some dialects he remembered his father saying so once, but now it sounded fragile, sacred. The woman's cries softened, becoming murmurs, then silence. The chief stood still for a long time before turning his head slightly toward the boy. His eyes were red now, rimmed with tears that refused to fall. And in that moment he didn't look like a warrior or a leader, he looked like a father breaking apart in slow motion. "She is my blood," he said, voice low and trembling. "And she dies in your hands." The boy wanted to speak, to beg him to see that he had done nothing wrong, that he had tried to save her, not take her. But before he could form a single word, the mother emerged from the barn. She carried her daughter's hand in hers, the girl's arm dangling lifelessly, her head turned toward the light. The woman's face was carved from stone, her grief hidden behind a mask of impossible strength. When she looked at the boy, her eyes were not angry, they were something worse. They were knowing. She breathed still. She said quietly in English, so soft and perfect it startled him, but not for long. Then she looked to her husband, her voice turning to steel. "Do what you must." And as she stepped aside, the boy felt the circle of warriors close around him again, their silence no longer fury but the stillness of judgment waiting to fall. The moment hung in the air, heavy and brittle as frost, as the warriors began to close in bows drawn, rifles raised, the circle tightening until the boy could feel their hatred pressing against his skin like the edge of a blade. His hands twitched at his sides, useless, cold. He didn't even bother reaching for his rifle this time. What would be the point? He'd tried every word he could think of, every plea, and all it had done was dig his grave deeper. The chief had given the order with a gesture so small it might have been missed, but the men understood it. Vengeance had been decided. And then, before a single shot was fired, the woman's voice sliced through the rising chaos. "Stop." The word was soft but carried like thunder, steady and commanding, and even the chief froze where he stood. The boy turned, breath caught in his throat, as she knelt once more beside her daughter in the snow just outside the barn. The girl's skin was pale as ash, her lips trembling with the shallow pull of a dying breath, but her fingers small, fragile, rose weakly, finding her mother's wrist. For a moment, no one breathed. Then her eyelids fluttered, and two dark eyes opened, cloudy but alive. The boy's heart jumped into his throat. She was awake barely. Impossibly awake. The mother's hands trembled as she cupped her daughter's cheek, whispering words too soft for the boy to hear, and the warriors looked on as if witnessing something sacred. The girl's gaze shifted, searching, until it found him standing alone in the ring of their fury, the snow stained with blood beneath his boots. Her lips parted, a single word forming with what breath she had left. Safe. It was barely a sound, just a whisper carried by the cold air, but it hit like a hammer. The chief's eyes widened. The crowd fell utterly still. The woman's body shook as she looked down at her daughter, as if unsure she'd heard right. "Tala," she whispered, her voice cracking. The girl's eyes drifted shut again, her breathing shallow but steady, as though the last of her strength had been spent on that one word. Safe. The woman's gaze rose slowly, her tears glistening in the pale morning light. And when her eyes met the boy's, he saw something shift within them like a storm breaking apart after days of darkness. She stood, turning toward her husband, and though her body trembled, her voice did not. "He helped her," she said, the words clear and deliberate, cutting through the frozen silence like the first crack of spring ice. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. The chief's face twisted, torn between pride and disbelief, between fury and the impossible mercy his wife was asking him to see. "You saw her," he said harshly. "You heard her." "I heard truth," she answered, stepping closer to him. She would not have lived the night if not for him. The boy could feel his pulse hammering against his throat, unsure whether he was being saved or drawn deeper into some new kind of danger. The chief's jaw clenched. He turned his face away, looking toward the distant ridges, his breath coming out in white clouds. The silence between him and his wife stretched thin, taut as a bowstring. Then, with a slow, heavy movement, he lowered his hand, the same hand that had been moments from giving the signal for the boy's death. Around them, the warriors exchanged uneasy glances, lowering their weapons but not their suspicion. "If she lives," the chief said finally, his voice raw and low, "then his life is spared. But if she dies, then the snow will drink both their blood," one of the younger warriors muttered bitterly. The woman turned toward him, her stare like a blade. "Then pray she lives," she said. The words carried weight, and even the boldest among them bowed their heads. The boy stood frozen, heart pounding, realizing that the only thing between him and death now was the fragile breath of a girl he didn't know, a girl who had called him safe. The chief barked an order in Apache, and the men began to move, setting camp near the edge of the clearing, their horses restless, snorting steam into the cold air. As the mother lifted her daughter back inside the barn, the boy caught her eye once more. "You spoke truth," she said quietly, just for him. "Now you must prove it." And then she was gone, leaving him alone in the snow, surrounded by enemies who no longer knew whether to hate him or thank him, while the world held its breath to see which of them would outlast the day the girl's life or his mercy. The chief's command came low and final, like the last rumble of thunder after a long storm, and instantly the warriors froze where they stood, the deadly stillness breaking just enough for the sound of shifting boots and restless horses to fill the air. He raised one hand, palm outward, and in that single motion the killing intent that had gripped the clearing began to ebb, though not vanish. The men obeyed reluctantly, uneasily lowering their rifles and bows, but the hatred in their eyes didn't fade. It lingered, coiled and watching, as if waiting for the first excuse to strike again. The boy felt his knees weaken in the snow, his breath coming ragged and shallow, though he dared not move, dared not show the relief clawing at the edge of his fear. The chief turned toward him with eyes like dark glass, reflective, unreadable, and yet behind them something heavy simmered, not mercy but restraint. "You live for now," the chief said in broken English, his voice carrying across the cold air. "Until she lives, or dies." His wife, still kneeling inside the barn beside the wounded girl, did not look up, but her soft humming low, mournful seemed to fill the space with something close to prayer. The chief barked an order in Apache, and before the boy could understand what was happening, two warriors stepped forward, their movements precise and wordless. One seized his arm, twisting it behind his back with brutal efficiency, while the other tore the rifle from the snow and tossed it aside. "Wait, please," the boy gasped, but they didn't understand or didn't care. A length of braided leather came down around his wrists, biting into his skin as they tied his hands behind him. The smell of horse sweat and smoke filled his lungs as one of them pulled a strip of cloth from his belt. A black blindfold, coarse and smelling faintly of ash. The boy's eyes widened. "No, I won't run," he tried to say. But the fabric came down hard across his face, the world vanishing into darkness. The sudden loss of sight made his pulse surge, his mind spinning with the sound of footsteps crunching around him, the muttered Apache words that might have been curses or prayers. The cold pressed against his skin, the bite of the bindings cutting deep. "Move." One of them barked, shoving him forward. His boots slid on the snow, stumbling over roots and frozen ground as unseen hands guided him with rough precision. Every sound became sharper, the creak of saddles, the snort of horses, the faint rattle of metal against leather. He felt the wind shift, smelled the lingering smoke of the fire that had nearly ended him, and realized with dizzy clarity that he was being taken not for judgment but for waiting to see whether the girl's fragile heartbeat would decide his fate. As they led him from the barnyard, he caught snatches of the chief's voice behind him, issuing orders. Some of the warriors were to stay behind, to watch the mother and the wounded girl, while the rest would return to their camp with the prisoner. The word prisoner echoed in his mind like an accusation. He thought of his father's ranch, of the empty hills and quiet cattle, and knew even if he ever saw them again, he would never see them the same. He was part of something far older now, older than guilt, older than mercy. The blindfold dampened with his breath, each inhale stifled, each exhale trembling. The rhythm of hooves surrounded him as they began to move, the leather reins snapping, the soft jingle of bridles marking the pace. He stumbled again, nearly falling, but a hand caught his shoulder and steadied him firm, calloused, and unexpectedly gentle. "Walk," came a low voice in accented English. He didn't know which warrior it belonged to, but the grip was not cruel, only careful, as though the man didn't relish what he was doing. "Where are you taking me?" the boy asked, his voice cracking. There was no answer, only the whisper of wind through pine as they climbed out of the valley. Snow fell again, light and slow, settling on his coat and melting into his collar. Somewhere behind him, he thought he heard the mother's song rise again, soft and distant, carrying across the frozen air like a thread of warmth refusing to die. He didn't know the words, but he understood the meaning. Something between mourning and hope. The chief's horse snorted nearby, the sound closer now, followed by his voice low, certain. "He will not die blind," he said in his own tongue, and though the boy couldn't understand, he felt the meaning like a heartbeat beneath his ribs. They were taking him to face judgment, but not yet. His life hung by the faint breath of a wounded girl, and as they led him into the vast white silence of the mountains, he realized mercy could be just as terrifying as death. They gave him a horse at dawn, a lean roan with a torn ear and wary eyes, and though his wrists were still bound, the blindfold was gone. The world reappeared in shards of pale light and cold breath, the horizon bruised with snow clouds. The boy blinked against the brightness, his heart thudding as he realized where he was riding among the same warriors who'd nearly killed him hours before. There were dozens around him now, spread out in silent formation, their horses moving in perfect rhythm, hooves muffled by the snow. He sat awkwardly in the saddle, rope biting his skin, too afraid to speak, too aware of the eyes that flicked toward him like knives. They said nothing, but their silence was louder than threats, heavy with judgment, with the grief of a people he had never understood. The chief rode at the front, his back straight, his head high beneath the weight of a feathered band that caught the rising Sunday. Beside him rode the woman, the girl's mother, her face unreadable, carved from sorrow and strength. Between them hung the stillness of too many things left unsaid. The boy's breath fogged the air, and he tried to look anywhere but at them. He caught glimpses of faces. Young men with eyes older than they should have been, scars etched deep into their cheeks. Elders wrapped in worn hides, hands calloused from lives carved against hunger and loss. Even the horses seemed marked by exhaustion, their hides scarred from long marches and hard winters. It wasn't an army he rode with, it was a nation limping through the ruins of its pride. The realization struck him like a blow. These were not savages or ghosts from campfire tales, they were people surviving the cost of being forgotten. As they climbed higher through the canyons, he saw the remnants of old battles scattered across the land, charred wagons half buried in snow, bones of cattle bleached by wind, rifle shells glinting like teeth beneath the frost. Every turn of the trail was a reminder of what men like his father had built their fortune on: land stolen, promises broken, peace traded for progress. The boy swallowed hard, shame curling in his gut. His father had told him stories of clearing these plains, of taming the wild tribes who stood in the way. He'd listened once with pride, too young to know the word for what it really was. Now he rode among the remnants of that history, each face around him a living echo of the price it demanded. When they stopped to rest near a frozen stream, the warriors dismounted wordlessly, some tending to the horses, others crouching by the water to drink. One, younger than the rest, approached him with a knife in hand. The boy tensed, every muscle coiling, but the warrior only cut the rope binding his wrists. The fibers fell away, leaving raw red marks across his skin. The young man met his eyes briefly, then spoke in halting English. "You are not free," he said, "but not slave." Then he turned away. The words hit the boy harder than any threat could have. He flexed his hands, feeling blood return, his fingers trembling as though they didn't belong to him. He looked around again, really looked this time. The warriors spoke softly to one another in their own language, their voices low and tired, more human than the stories had ever made them. One man sat mending a broken bridle with careful hands. Another carved small shapes from wood: a bird, a horse, a child's toy, maybe. He realized then that they were not marching toward war, they were retreating from it, carrying their wounded, their memories, their ghosts. The chief's wife sat apart, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the land met the sky, her daughter's name whispering through her lips like a prayer. The boy watched her, understanding now that grief had no language barrier. It spoke in the stillness between heartbeats, in the way someone looked at the ground when they'd lost too much to hope for more. When they rode again, the wind rose with them, carrying the faint sound of the tribe's morning songs through the canyon. The boy closed his eyes for a moment, letting the melody sink into him. It wasn't a song of vengeance, it was survival. By the time the sun began to set, painting the cliffs in red and gold, the boy knew that what he was riding through was not hatred, it was history. And for the first time in his life, he wished he could apologize for all the things he hadn't done but still carried the weight of, simply for being born on the other side of their sorrow. Dawn came slow and gray, crawling over the canyon like an old sorrow waking from sleep, the kind of light that didn't warm but only revealed what the night had hidden. The boy rode in silence among them as they descended toward the riverbed, the cold air sharp enough to cut his lungs. No one spoke. The sound of hooves against the frost-muted ground echoed like a heartbeat through the stillness. When they stopped, he knew before anyone said a word what they had come to do. The mother dismounted first, her steps measured, reverent, as she carried her daughter's small, still body wrapped in deerskin, the weight of it both too heavy and too light in her arms. The boy wanted to turn away, but he couldn't. Something rooted him there, forcing him to witness what he had prayed wouldn't come to pass. The girl's face was peaceful now, free of the pain that had twisted it the night before. Her skin, once feverish, had gone pale as the snow, her dark hair spilling across the hide like ink over parchment. Even in death, she looked impossibly young, too young to belong to tragedy, too young to have seen what she must have seen. The warriors formed a half-circle around the open earth, their heads bowed, their faces carved with the kind of grief that did not ask for tears. The chief stood apart, his back straight, his shadow stretching long over the ground as the first light touched the canyon rim. He said something in Apache, a voice roughened not by anger this time but by exhaustion, by the breaking weight of a father's loss. The boy didn't understand the words, but the rhythm of them, the rise and fall, told him everything. They were words for letting go, for asking the spirits to carry what he could not bear to hold. The mother knelt by the grave, lowering her daughter gently into the shallow bed of red clay, her fingers tracing the girl's cheek one last time. When she looked up, her eyes found the boy. He froze under that gaze, not cold, not cruel, but unbearably human. She gestured for him to come closer. The warriors shifted uneasily as he obeyed, each step feeling like trespass. When he reached her, she said softly, "You gave her warmth when the night would have taken her. You kept her safe long enough for me to say goodbye." Her voice trembled, but did not break. From beside her, she lifted the wool blanket, the one he had wrapped around the girl that first night, still stained faintly with her blood, his hands, her breath. "This was yours," she said. "Now it is ours." The boy opened his mouth to speak, to say he didn't deserve the honor. But she pressed the fabric to her heart before laying it across the grave, smoothing it gently over the mound of earth. The blanket looked strange there, an ordinary thing turned sacred by grief, its coarse fibers holding the memory of warmth that could no longer be given. The wind rose suddenly, catching the edges, and the mother whispered something to it in her tongue. The chief bowed his head, and slowly, one by one, the others followed. Even the horses seemed to understand, lowering their heads as the wind carried the song of farewell through the canyon. It wasn't loud, wasn't proud, it was a low, steady hum, like the sound the earth makes when it forgives. The boy stood among them, the ache in his chest too big for breath. He had done so little, and yet here he was, part of something vast and painful and beautiful. When the mother stood, she looked at him again, her face streaked with tears that glistened like the melting frost. "She called you safe," she said quietly. "We will remember that." Then she stepped back to her husband's side, her hand finding his, their grief shared in silence. The chief looked at the boy for a long, unreadable moment, then nodded once, a gesture not of friendship, but of recognition. Around them, the first light of full morning poured into the canyon, turning the snow gold, touching the blanket with warmth as if the sun itself were laying its own benediction. And in that fragile moment, surrounded by the people who had every reason to hate him, the boy realized something more powerful than mercy had been born there, something neither side could name, but both could feel. The dead girl's rest had become a bridge, her final breath carrying a peace that no treaty could ever write. Night came cold and moonless, the canyon wrapped in silence but for the low murmur of fire and the restless snort of horses beyond the circle of tents. The boy sat apart from the others, his wrists raw and his thoughts heavier than the iron sky. Since the burial, no one had spoken to him, though they no longer watched him with the same fire in their eyes. He was not an enemy now. Not entirely, more like a question none of them knew how to answer. Smoke curled from the fire beside him, sweet with sage and pine, rising toward the stars like prayers half remembered. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there when he heard footsteps crunch softly behind him. The sound was unhurried, deliberate. He turned, expecting one of the guards, but instead saw the tall shape of the chief stepping into the firelight. The man's shadow stretched long across the ground, his face carved from darkness and memory, his eyes catching the light like embers that refused to die. The boy scrambled to his feet out of instinct, his hands still bound before him, but the chief motioned for him to sit. "No," he said in his rough, broken English. "No fear now." The boy hesitated, then lowered himself back to the ground. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, throwing sparks into the cold air. The chief's gaze stayed fixed on the flames as he finally began to speak, not to accuse, but to remember. "You found her in the snow," he said slowly, his words thick with the effort of another language. "You gave her fire, gave her breath. You saved her." His voice faltered then, only slightly, but it was enough to make the boy look up. In the firelight, the chief's face seemed older than before, worn not just by age but by grief that had no place left to go. "Few white men would," he said. The boy swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. "It wasn't courage," he said quietly. "It was just what was right." The chief nodded once, as though he understood, though his eyes still held something unspoken. "Right," he echoed, tasting the word. "For my people, right means survive. For your people." He let the words trail off, and the boy felt the truth of it settle like ash. The chief reached into his belt and drew a knife, not in anger, but with quiet purpose. The blade caught the firelight, sharp and clean. The boy froze, breath held, until the man knelt beside him and slid the blade beneath the bindings at his wrists. With a single, practiced pull, the leather cord split, and his hands fell free. Blood rushed back into his fingers, stinging, alive. "No more chains," the chief said softly, standing again. "For you, or for me." The boy stared down at his freed hands, the red marks stark against his skin. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You could have killed me. You had reason to." The chief's eyes lifted to the stars, where the smoke faded into the blackness. "The Great Spirit takes what he will," he said. "But sometimes He leaves us to remember mercy." He looked back at the boy then, and his expression hardened, not cruel, but solemn, carved with the weight of warning. "You will go home," he said. "Now." The words hung in the air, final and strange. "Home?" the boy repeated. "You're letting me go?" The chief nodded. "You walked into our sorrow, and you did not run. That is enough. But remember," his tone shifted, low and grave, "your kind will not forgive what you have done." The boy frowned. "What I've done?" The chief's gaze held his, unflinching. "You saw us," he said. "You helped us. To them, that is betrayal." The fire cracked, sending sparks dancing between them. The boy felt the meaning of those words sink deep into his chest. He would go home, but home would not be the same. To his people, he'd crossed a line no one returned from. He nodded slowly, the truth of it settling like snow. "Then I'll take that burden," he said quietly. "She was worth it." The chief studied him a long while, then extended his hand, a gesture of rare grace. The boy hesitated only a heartbeat before clasping it. Their hands met, rough and scarred, two lives divided by history but joined, for a fleeting moment, by something deeper than hate. "Go," the chief said, stepping back into the shadows, "before the sun wakes." And so the boy did. He saddled the roan they'd given him. The canyon wind cold on his face as he rode into the vast, dark plain. Behind him, the campfires flickered like distant stars, fading one by one until the land swallowed them whole. Ahead lay home, or what remained of it, and the knowledge that sometimes peace costs more than war ever could. The ranch came into view under a sky streaked with red and gray, the colors of old blood and new dawn, and the boy felt his stomach twist as the familiar outline of the house rose from the prairie, solid, sharp, and colder than the mountains he'd left behind. Smoke drifted from the chimney, thin and straight, and the corral fence he'd built last spring still leaned where he'd meant to mend it. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing did. His hands tightened on the reins as the horse slowed, its breath pluming white in the chill air. The quiet before he reached the yard was heavy, too heavy, and when he saw the figure waiting on the porch, he knew why. His father stood there like a statue carved from iron and spite, shotgun cradled across his arms, the brim of his hat shadowing a face that hadn't changed in years, except to grow meaner. The boy stopped a dozen paces away, dismounted slowly, and tried to speak, but his father's voice cut through the air first. "Where in God's hell have you been?" The tone wasn't worry, it was accusation, sharp as a whip crack. The boy swallowed hard, dust scraping his throat. "North," he said quietly. "I found someone hurt in the snow. A girl." The old man's eyes narrowed. "A girl?" he spat. "You mean one of them?" The word was venom. "I heard the talk in town. Said you took up with an Apache girl, brought her here like a damned pet." The boy flinched but didn't look away. "She was dying," he said. "Shot and left to bleed. I did what you taught me to do when something's suffering." His father barked a bitter laugh. "Don't you throw my lessons back at me, boy. There's a difference between saving a creature and harboring the enemy." The boy felt the old fear stir in his chest, the kind that had kept him silent through years of that same voice, that same rage, but this time, it broke against something harder. He took a step forward, meeting his father's glare. "She wasn't the enemy," he said, each word steady as a nail. "She was a person." His father's hands tightened on the shotgun. "A person who'd see us dead. You think they'd show you mercy? You think her kind would have spared you?" The boy thought of the canyon, of the chief's trembling voice, the mother's tears, the song that carried through the cold air. "They did," he said simply. "They spared me." The words hit his father like a blow, his face twisting as if he couldn't comprehend them. "You're lying." "I'm not," the boy said. "They buried her with my blanket, the one Ma made before she passed. They treated it like it meant something, like she did." The old man's face darkened, his voice rising. "You don't know what they are. You don't know what they've done." The boy felt something in him snap quietly, completely. "And you don't know what we've done," he said. The silence that followed was louder than any argument they'd ever had. The father's breath came heavy, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. The boy saw it in his eyes, the flicker of doubt, the ghost of shame, but it vanished as quick as it came. "You've been poisoned by them," the man growled. "You've forgotten who you are." "No," the boy said, voice low but steady. "I finally remembered." He took another step forward, close enough now to see the tremor in his father's hand as he gripped the shotgun. "You told me to be a man, to do what's right. That's what I did. You just don't like what right looks like anymore." The air between them crackled with years of unspoken words. All the buried anger and quiet longing for approval turned to ash. His father's jaw clenched. For a long, dangerous moment, the boy thought he might pull the trigger, but then the old man's arm dropped, the weight of the gun dragging it down. He looked away, unable to hold his son's gaze. "Get off my land," he said hoarsely. The words stung, but the boy only nodded. "All right," he said. "But it's not yours anymore, not in any way that matters." He turned back toward his horse, the wind tugging at his coat, carrying the smell of dust and sage. As he swung into the saddle, he looked once more at the man who'd raised him out of fear, not love. "You were wrong," he said quietly. "Mercy ain't weakness. It's the only thing keeping this world from rotting completely." His father said nothing. He just stood there, small against the rising sun, the shotgun hanging limp at his side. The boy kicked his horse into motion, riding toward the hills, toward the line where the earth met the sky. Behind him, the ranch faded into distance and shadow, a place he'd outgrown, a ghost of the man he refused to become. Ahead lay the unknown, but it was clean, honest, and his. The wind that night was soft and cool, carrying the scent of rain and wild sage as it drifted across the empty land. The boy, no longer quite a boy, not after what he'd seen, stood on the porch of the ranch that wasn't his anymore, though the walls still whispered his name when the wind passed through the cracks. The stars stretched wide above him, endless and sharp, their light falling silver on the fields where the cattle slept, on the barn that creaked like an old memory, and on the open gate where no father waited now, only the silence of what had been left behind. Weeks had passed since he rode away from that bitter confrontation, weeks spent in the hills, chasing work and quiet, mending fences for men who didn't ask questions. But the land had called him back, not the house, not the name, but the dirt beneath it, the place where his mother's voice still seemed to hum in the long grass. He had returned not to stay, but to say goodbye properly this time. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, and the rooms inside were hollow, emptied of his father's anger and the smell of old tobacco. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called a long, low sound that rose and fell like mourning. He listened, leaning against the porch rail, his eyes tracing the horizon. That was when he heard it faint at first, barely more than a tremor against the earth, then another. A slow, rhythmic thudding carried on the wind, too deliberate to be thunder. Drums. His breath caught, his heart stilling in his chest. They came in waves, low and steady, rising and falling like a heartbeat in the distance, echoing from the hills to the north where the canyon lay. He knew that rhythm. He'd felt it once before, carried through the ground beneath his knees as they buried the girl beneath the dawn. The sound wasn't threat, it was remembrance. Reverence. He stepped down into the yard, boots sinking into the cool dirt, and turned toward the sound. The drums grew louder for a moment, then softened again, fading into the night until only the whisper of the wind remained. The boy stood still, eyes stinging with something between sorrow and peace. Then he saw it, something hanging from the fence post nearest the corral, glinting faintly in the starlight. He approached slowly, his breath shallow, and when he reached it, his knees nearly gave. A blanket, new, yet familiar. Woven thick and strong, its threads dyed in the deep reds and ochres of Apache craft, lined with black and white symbols that told stories he didn't yet understand. He reached out and touched it, the fibers soft beneath his fingers, still carrying the faint smell of smoke and cedar. Tied to one corner was a single eagle feather, bound with a strip of leather. His throat tightened. They had come, maybe not all, maybe not even the chief himself, but someone had ridden through the night to bring it here, to lay it across his fence like an offering, a bridge between worlds that had once stood at war. He lifted it gently, feeling the weight of it not heavy, but full. It was their way of saying, "We remember." The blanket was more than gratitude. It was forgiveness woven by hands that had known loss, hands that had buried love and still chosen mercy. The boy looked up at the stars again, his heart steady now, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel divided between two worlds. He was simply part of the land, its grief, its grace, its unending rhythm. He draped the blanket over his shoulders, letting it rest there like the touch of a friend, a ghost, a promise. In the distance, a final drumbeat echoed faintly across the hills, slow and certain, before fading into silence. The boy smiled, small and quiet, his breath clouding in the night air. "I remember too," he whispered. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, the blanket warm around him, the stars watching like old sentinels above the plains. Behind him, the wind picked up again, brushing against the fence where the blanket had hung, lifting a corner of it toward the sky as if the night itself was bowing in return.